Hey everybody, the Coop here. I'm ranking all of the sorceries in Elden Ring from A to Z. This is my rating system. Always slot, good spell, decent spell, do not use. First up is Adula's Moonblade. Adula's Moonblade is the best greatsword spell. It's one of my personal favorites, and I find it very good in PvP and PvE. It has huge amounts of range, secondary hitbox that flies out, and it deals frost damage as well. It's just a super good overall spell in both PvP and PvE. Next up is Ambush Shard. Ambush Shard is a pretty niche spell, but is super good at catching people who are blocking, especially great shield users in PvP. Because of its very niche focus, I can't really rate it any higher than what it is here. Ancient Death Rancor. All of the death spells, in my opinion, are very bad, but Ancient Death Rancor is definitely the most usable of them all. With really, really high tracking, I think that Ancient Death Rancor has really decent applications in PvE and in invasions. Briars of Punishment. For a long time, I was sleeping on Briars, but someone in my chat convinced me that Briars is actually better than I think it is. And the ability to cancel into Briars and to be able to do some kind of sneaky bleed damage makes it pretty decent, but still very situational. And its faith requirement obviously kind of makes it go down a slot. Cannon of Haima is really fun in PvE and invasions. Its main utility in PvP is its knockback for knocking people off of the ledge, but I don't think that it's very reliable to hit against a good opponent. They're just going to run out of the way in PvP, and in PvE, it does have some really nice ability to clear crowds, but it's again quite situational. CARIAN Greatsword. Because of how good Adula's is, I just can't really recommend this one. CARIAN PHALANX. CARIAN PHALANX, in my opinion, is one of the best spells in the game. It's good in both PvP and PvE, mainly because it not only does a lot of damage, but each of these blades does quite a lot of stagger damage. So even though you won't consistently hit it on good opponents in PvP, it's a really easy way of protecting yourself, even in PvE. Something surges towards you and they get caught by all the blades. It's just a really good spell overall. CARIAN Piercer. CARIAN Piercer is one of my favorites, both for PvP and PvE. It does a metric ton of stagger damage. I've seen it do up to and over 1.5k even in PvP. It's really good at roll catching in PvP. It has huge amounts of stagger damage. You can cancel into it with other spells. It's just a really great spell overall. CARIAN Retaliation. It's just really bad. Just use the Ash of War on the shield instead. Just trust me, all the numbers are worse. It's very bad. CARIAN Slicer. CARIAN Slicer is very, very powerful. Perhaps even meta-defining right now. CARIAN Slicer has been showing up in really high-tier PvP tournaments and showing really strong results. CARIAN Slicer's ability to cancel into other spells also lifts up the ability of those other spells. For example, COMET, but we'll get to that when we talk about it. So CARIAN Slicer is triple S tier, one of the best spells in the game. Collapsing Stars. Collapsing Stars is unfortunately outclassed by Stars of Ruin, but it is a really interesting mix-up in PvP. The timing is very different, so it can often catch opponents off guard. In PvE, just use Stars of Ruin or some other spells instead. COMET. COMET is fairly mediocre, but it is the only glintstone spell that isn't completely eclipsed by Swift Glintstone Shard. It's the ability to cancel from Slicer into COMET, for me, has leveled up COMET in terms of priority. But it still is very FP hungry and doesn't deal a ton of damage for it. So there's often other better spells that we can do. COMET AZUR. Possibly the most iconic mage spell in Elden Ring because of all the guides talking about how OP it is. COMET AZUR is a very, very good spell for boss melting, specifically against bosses that aren't very mobile or are easily staggered. COMET AZUR is basically a one-button solution to Commander Nail, which is, you know, gives a lot of people grief. But other than that, COMET AZUR is really bad against mobile opponents. It's very bad in PvP. So it definitely ranks at this ranking, but obviously, you know, if you're going into a specific boss fight where you know you can get it off, including the infinite FP flask, you know, go for it. It's awesome. Crystal Barrage. Crystal Barrage is a very weird spell. I wish it was good, but it's really not. Just don't use Crystal Barrage. Crystal Burst. This is our crappy version of Bestial Sling, and it could be good, but it just does so little damage, it's not worth doing. Crystal Release. Again, interesting in terms of design, but the fact that it forces us to stand still is basically a death sentence in both PvP and PvE. If we're going to stand still, we're going to cast COMET AZUR. Just not worth using. Crystal Torrent. Again, just another worse version of COMET AZUR. Not worth using at all. Eternal Darkness. Eternal Darkness is a really awesome utility spell that is really, really good for the mage matchup in PvP, and has some utility in PvE. Because it's fairly limited in PvE, it's rated like this, but it definitely is really good in the mage matchup. Explosive Ghost Flame. Explosive Ghost Flame really relies on your opponents to get caught by it. So in my opinion, it's not worth running. Its damage is also quite lackluster. Frozen Armament kind of looked like it could be good on the surface because Frost scales with intelligence, but just using a Frost Ash of War is significantly better. Specifically, the Chilling Mist Ash of War just does this, but is better and uses less FP. Yeah, it's useless. It's useless. FIA'S Mist. FIA'S Mist is interesting in that it is one of the only things in the game that can build up Death Blight. It is a very interesting AoE tool, and I have experimented with combining it with the thing that makes spells last longer to have more area denial. But it's very situational. But I think it's a very fun spell, but I just don't think it's very good. Founding Rain of Stars. I mean, it's definitely one of the most visually cool spells. It's another area denial spell, but it's actually rates fairly high for me. Quite a lot of times I have put opponents in a situation with Founding Rain of Stars where they have no choice but to come in and risk being, you know, getting plinked for damage inside the Founding Rain of Stars. It's also pretty decent in PvE in that it can really help you when you're getting swarmed by a lot of people. It does stagger just a little bit, so it can actually help in that way as well. I just find it one of the better area denial spells in the game. Freezing Mist. Again, another lingering AoE. This one has some nice, you know, vision obscuring stuff as well. But again, it's just strictly worse than a lot of the other things that we could be doing. It has a nice duration, much longer than FIA'S, which is nice. But yeah, again, Chilling Mist just kind of outshines this. Gelmir's Fury. Gelmir's Fury is one of the Faith spells, and it just does not do the damage and doesn't do. It is so random in its projectile placement that it's really not worth using. GLINTBLADE Phalanx. This is just worse than the CARIAN Phalanx. GLINTSTONE Arc. This is your best friend in the early game and then completely falls off a cliff. GLINTSTONE Comet Shard. Just worse than Comet. Just use Comet. Alrighty, GLINTSTONE Ice Crag. The Ice Crag has some niche use that's better than these other spells in that it builds up frost, but there are just better spells that we can be adding to our slot. If you specifically want to use more frost, again, I just suggest using a Duelist Moonblade, both in PvP and PvE. Glintstone Pebble should be obvious, but quick Glintstone Shard is just better. Glintstone Stars. Stars of Ruin is better. Use that. Gravity Well. I actually particularly like Gravity Well for invasions just because it's sometimes fun to pull people off of cliffs and stuff. But other than that, it's not very good. Great Glintstone Shard. Again, this can be somewhat useful in PvE depending on where in the game you are, but it will immediately get overshadowed by Comet, so just use Comet. Oracle Bubbles. I had to switch my helmet for this one. It's not good. GREATBLADE Phalanx. I actually rather like this one for PvE. It does a huge amount of stagger damage, but in PvP it's basically useless. LORETTA'S GREATBOW. Aesthetically, one of the coolest spells in my opinion, but just overshadowed by Loretta's Mastery. Loretta's Mastery is one of the weirdest spells because it's difficult to show in not PvP context, but the seeking on these spells is very wild, and they really go for a very long distance. So specifically in invasions or in a duel arena, if your opponent is like sitting all the way across the arena from you, Loretta's Mastery, you can do some really funky stuff where you lock onto your opponent and then face the opposite direction, and then you fire them straight up in the air and they will seek all the way back around, giving you some extra time to run at your opponent and follow up. And again, the lock on is like very strong. Lucidity. Lucidity alleviates sleep and madness. So if you're if this spell obviously gets a lot better if we're dealing with a huge sleep and madness meta, and there's some theories that that's where the next DLC is going, but until we actually live in that meta, this spell is very bad, and also you can just use boluses for the same purposes. Magic Downpour. It's bad. Magic GLINTBLADE. When I first saw Magic GLINTBLADE, I thought this was really bad, but I actually think it's very good. It has very high cast speed, and especially in PvP, it can really mess up your opponent with timings. In PvE, it's certainly a lot worse. Magma Shot. I don't actually super hate this ability. I like that it leaves magma and that we could like throw it at our feet to get a safe area. But it's yeah, all of the strength, intelligence, faith spells are simply not very good, and these ones require a lot of setup to use properly. But I could see a world where you make a build specifically around it and it gets a lot better. Meteorite. Yeah, it's bad. The better version is also bad, so Meteorite's bad. Rancor Call. The Ancient Death Rancor is better, just use that. Ronnie's Dark Moon. Ronnie's Dark Moon is a really interesting mix-up in both PvP and PvE. I think it's very good in PvE in that it hits for frost as well as it applies the magic damage debuff, so it helps you deal a lot more damage as well. RENALLA'S Full Moon is just the worst version of that, so, you know, just use Ronnie's. Rock Blaster. This spell is hilarious, in my opinion. Rock Blaster can actually mess people up in the same way that like Barrage Executioner Sword can. In a very like we've tested this like in a specific situation. You can just like stun lock people with this, but yeah, overall it's very bad. Rock Sling. Rock Sling is a really amazing early game spell that falls off pretty quickly. It does physical damage as well, so we have a way of varying up our damage. It's bad in PvP and it falls off in PvE, although it does continue to do a lot of stagger damage late in the game, so it can be used for that purpose as well. Roiling Magma. Very fun area denial spell, but ultimately not that good. Rykard's Rancor. A very flashy spell, but it really doesn't do very much damage. Again, another decent area denial tool, but in my opinion, I think that Founding Rate of Stars just does what this does, but better. Scholar's Armament. Again, the Ash of War system really just destroys this for us. We don't really need this. Scholar's Shield. This one is a little bit better. It can have uses in PvP and PvE, but generally there are other ways of getting magic resist on shields so that we don't really need to do this. Shard Spiral. This is a spell that I would have rated really badly earlier, but has really grown on me. It's very powerful in PvP and PvE, and its ability to like hit for multiple times makes it quite strong. Shattering Crystal. This is the better version of Bestial Sling, but it has quite a lot of charge up time, and its only real main use in PvP is catching rolls, but we have better tools for doing that. Star Shower. Now, Star Shower shoots less projectiles than Stars of Ruin, so you might think that it's just strictly worse, but Star Shower has one thing that Stars of Ruin doesn't have, which is that it deals quite a lot of poise damage. So if your opponent isn't able to dodge all of them, Star Shower can stagger in a way that Stars of Ruin just can't. So it might even be worth considering running both of them together, but I do think that Star Shower has its place. Starlight. This one's really OP if you're, you know, if you don't like the dark. Alright, the moment you've all been waiting for, Stars of Ruin. Stars of Ruin is very powerful because when it hits, it deals a lot of damage, but Stars of Ruin is actually quite easy to dodge, and especially people are starting to get more and more used to dodging it. It's definitely an always slot, but it's really nice to use more, in my opinion, as a mix-up when you know you're going to be able to hit quite a lot of them. Swift Glintstone Shard. This is an always slot all the time. This outperforms every single other Glintstone Shard for multiple reasons. One, it has a jumping attack, it has a rolling, backstepping attack, a rolling attack. It's just the most action-oriented spell that we have, and it's really good in PvP and PvE. TERRA Magica. TERRA Magica is obviously really great in PvE, where we can set this up and actually use it to its fullest. And it's actually also pretty interesting in PvP because it sets up an area where your opponent is kind of forced to come and challenge you out of that area to avoid getting a pretty sizable buff. So I actually I really like this one. Bob's Barrier. Tibia Summons, yeah, is also very bad. I mean, it's fun if you're trying to do like a JoJo build, but yeah, again, all of the Faith sorceries are pretty bad. Unseen Blade. Unseed Blade is kind of fun. Unfortunately, they can see the action lines off of it, but you can definitely mess with your opponent and catch them unawares with this one. This one's really fun to mess with, but I don't think is actually that good. Unseen Form. They did buff an Unseen Form in 1.04, but it is the shrouding effect is increased for opponents. So again, this is like a fun shenanigans spell for PV, you know, for PvP. It's not even particularly effective in PvE because it doesn't really help you run by anyone. So yeah, I just don't really recommend this one. ZAMOR, last but not least, ZAMOR ICESTORM. ZAMOR ICESTORM is really nice in that it leaves a persistent area like that, but it doesn't last very long, and it has a huge amount of charge up. It doesn't do very much stagger damage, so it can be useful, but there's definitely just better area denial spells. And I just realized I missed a bunch, so we'll quickly go over these. Gavel of Haima. I actually really like Gavel of Haima in PvP and PvP. It's really hard to interrupt, and it does a ton of stagger damage. I really like it. BRIARS of Sin is also pretty interesting. This is another, you know, interesting AoE denial thing. And so that's actually, if opponent is rushing you down, you can catch them with that. It does quite a lot of stagger damage. Night Shard and Night Comet both recently got a buff. I think both of these are actually very good and worth running. We have also recently figured out that if you dual wield the Staff of Loss gives Night Sorceries a 30% buff, and if you dual wield them, you get a 60% buff. It is to just the specifically the night spells, but I think that this actually is a very powerful setup in both PvP and PvE. Fun fact about these spells in PvE is enemies don't dodge any of the night spells. So you can guaranteed hit them even on the NPC invader enemies. Okay, and there are all of the sorceries for Elden Ring. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening to me rant about that for a little while. If you like it, please hit subscribe. If you guys are on TikTok, please hit that follow button, and we will see you in the next guide, where we're going to do incantations.